championing inclusivity.
Look out for the launching of our gender policy, a commitment to gender equality for all boys and girls, men and women.
Sponsored by the Ministry of Social Development and Gender Affairs with funding by UNESCO.
Welcome back to Voices on WINN FM 98.9. I'm your host for today, Devon Cornelius. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. As I mentioned earlier, we are being joined with Mrs. Angelina Gracie Suku-Bob, and she is an attorney at law. As you know, each year on October 10th, the World Day Against the Death Penalty is observed by the global abolitionist movement to support the call for the universal abolition of capital punishment. The day encourages and consolidates the political and general awareness of the worldwide movement against the death penalty. And Mrs. Suku-Bob will be weighing in and making a presentation on this topic. Good afternoon, Angelina, and are you hearing us?
Good afternoon, Devon. I can hear you fine. Thank you for having me on.
And thank you so much for joining us today. So, as I mentioned before, you're here to talk about, essentially, to bring awareness to the need to abolish the death penalty. As I mentioned earlier, the World Day Against the Death Penalty is observed on October 10th each year. I remember around this time, we were here last year, along with lawyer Chesley Hamilton on this very same topic. This year's theme focuses on women and the death penalty, an invisible reality. Mrs. Bob, you may go ahead.
Thank you. Before we get into the theme for this year and around the issues about the death penalty, please permit me to just recap on the organization that I represent. It's called Greater Caribbean for Life.
Sure.
And it is it was formed in 2013, and it's a non-governmental, non-profit organization. It is the only human rights organization in the Greater Caribbean which focuses on the issue of death penalty, bringing awareness to the issues surrounding death penalty, as well as why we believe it should be abolished, or in the interim, why a moratorium should be observed. And we have a number of resources in which we assist local human rights groups as well as persons who are facing the death penalty with resources, whether it be legal, media resources, and in some circumstances, financial assistance to combat the sentencing to death, or in the event that an individual is on death row, appeals up to the Privy Council or the Caribbean Court of Justice if you are in Barbados and Dominica. So this organization plays a very important role, although in a very unpopular topic for many, because, as you know, the issue of whether or not the death penalty should be retained or abolished always seem to bring up very heated emotions, understandably so. But our organization has taken up the fort since 2013 on an invitation from the EU as well as the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty. And you can find us on all forms of social media by our name, Greater Caribbean for Life, and our website is gcforlife.org.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Gracie Sokupab. So, as I said earlier, each year on October 10th, we celebrate, or we observe rather, the global abolitionist movement to support the call for the universal abolition of capital punishment. As said, the day encourages and consolidates the political and general awareness of the worldwide movement against the death penalty. And this year marks the 19th day of observance, and the theme focuses on women and the death penalty, an invisible reality. Can you weigh in on the theme as to why that was chosen and what the theme really is trying to bring out?
Sure. So every year a different theme is chosen to show that there are many facets to the death penalty. We just use the phrase, but there are real individuals, there are real lives that are affected, and sometimes not just the individual who is on death row, or sometimes we don't put a face or story behind those that are behind death row. So last year we would have done access to justice and how persons can be found guilty of crimes just simply because they did not have the resources. This year the focus is on women, and one of the 10 main reasons why we advocate for the abolition of the death penalty is because it does discriminate. And so you find persons who are in minority groups, which would include women, they sometimes have additional issues which one may not necessarily appreciate, because sometimes we seem to just believe that persons who are on death row are persons probably from gangs and are male. With women, when they are on death row, there is realities that they have to face. For example, there are occasions on which women may be pregnant and they may be either on remand facing a trial or convicted, and whether you're pregnant or not does not play a role at all in the type of sentence that you get. And so you've had women who've had children in prison, and of course the mortality rate would obviously be high because of the conditions of prison. Women who've had to raise their infants before they can be taken by other family members, and that has been played out, including in as recent as 2015 in the UK, where you had an 18-year-old who was in prison on death row. Her baby died because of the conditions there, and the prison authorities got counseling for the prison officers and not for the mother of the child, who obviously would have faced a more detrimental effect from the passing of her child. So when a woman is on remand or sentenced to death, usually it affects the family home more so than when a male counterpart is sentenced to death, simply because whether you believe it's biology or whether it's culture, women tend to be the cornerstone of the household. In some cases, you have single parent mothers. And when they face the death penalty, it means that children would be left behind, sometimes as often. And that always affects the wider society and children more than it would had a male counterpart be sent to jail. So we look at it in particular with women, that when you consider whether or not she should be on death row, there are more factors to consider simply than the crime that has been committed. And believe it or not, there are a lot of women who are on death row or who would have, through advocacy, had their sentence commuted. There's right now over 700,000 women who are on death row or facing death row. The exact figure being, well, not exact, but the estimate being around 741,000 women. In St Kitts, we do not have any female inmates that are on death row, but we do have one individual who is serving a life sentence for manslaughter. At least that is based on information I received from our prisons yesterday. So even in Little St Kitts, we do have the issue of women being on life sentence or behind bar for crimes such as murder. It is here at home as well. Another factor and a reason why we wanted to bring women to the forefront is, up until recently, while a man could use provocation as a defense, for example, if he were to come home and find his wife with another individual in bed, women wouldn't necessarily afford the same type of defense, particularly if she took her partner's life as retaliation for domestic violence or abuse that she may have faced over a number of years. In recent times, maybe in the last 10 to 15 years, in some parts of the world, there's now a defense known as battered woman syndrome, which can be used not to absolve a female from committing a crime, but which can be used as a mitigating factor to reduce her sentence from death to life if she takes her partner's life as a result of having been abused sexually or domestically for a period of time, and then she eventually takes matters into her own hands. Domestic violence, of course, is a very real issue that is faced in all countries, including here in St Kitts and Nevis. the worldwide statistics suggest 1 out of 3 women would at some point in their lives be a victim of domestic violence. So the questions around this death penalty and it being an automatic death sentence unless the courts or your attorneys can show why it should not, it really brings home how it can affect women. And so we thought that this year it would be, especially with women and women issues really coming to the forefront in the last few years, that it is one of the focuses that we should have for this year.
Thank you so much. Angelina, what were some of the recommendations that came out of the St Kitts and Nevis Universal Periodic Review that was held on the death penalty in January 2021?
Okay, so as part of the UN, every 5 years, each country has to have a peer review by about 65 countries. And this year, St Kitts review came up on the 19th of January 2021. Now, the Universal Periodic Review looks at all manner of human rights. And of course, the right to life would be one of them. So in the 65 countries that reviewed St. Kitts and Nevis status in terms of its compliance with human rights, we had an increase of 23 countries making very still and unexpressed recommendations that St. Kitts abolish the death penalty. This is up from 17 in 2015, and requiring St. Kitts to ratify the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, as well as the optional protocol, which specifically deals with allowing persons who are on death row to challenge on an international level sentences to death, or at the very least to have what is a legal moratorium on the death penalty, meaning not just well, we've sort of not executed anyone since 2008, but to have expressed indication that no death penalty would be sought or no one would be executed for a particular period of time, whether it's 4 years or 5 years. The UN, every 5 years as well, also have a declaration indicating that there would be a moratorium on death penalty, and each country will have to indicate whether or not they vote in favor of the moratorium for their particular country. St. Kitts has always voted against having a moratorium on the death penalty. So I should perhaps pause here to just go back and remind everyone that in St. Kitts and Nevis, under our constitution, while one is guaranteed the right to life, that right is subject to certain exceptions. And one of those exceptions is if an individual has been convicted by a court of law for committing either murder or treason. So on our books, once you are convicted of murder, then you should be given the death penalty. We have had, however, a number of cases coming out of the Eastern Caribbean Supreme Court, the Privy Council, which is our highest court, as well as the CCG, indicating that automatic sentence to death after being convicted of murder is akin to cruel and inhumane treatment. And as a result, it should really be preserved for the worst of the worst crimes. And the standard to establish worst of the worst is relatively high. So while it isn't as automatic as before, it is still something that could happen if one is convicted of murder. When the pair countries made these recommendations to St. Kitts, Ms. Kay Bass, the Permanent Secretary for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who presented St. Kitts' report on how they've been complying with human rights obligations, indicated that St. Kitts and Nevis will use its local laws to address the issue of the death penalty. So, of course, while you would have your peers indicating that you should abolish the death penalty. That was a very diplomatic way of saying no, don't go there. Ms. Bass did indicate very proudly that the last execution in St. Kitts would have been 12 years ago, and that would have been the infamous execution of Mr. Charles Laplace in December of 2008.
Right.
And she would have indicated that in 35 years, only 3 persons were executed in the Federation. So while she was basically saying that in St. Kitts and Nevis, in law we use a phrase called de facto, which means in reality, St. Kitts has been practicing a sort of moratorium because there has been no one sentenced or executed within this 12 years, and only 3 in 35 years. For some reason, St. Kitts, from a legal perspective, along with all Caribbean countries, insists on keeping the death penalty as being the form of punishment for someone convicted of murder, unless, of course, the judge during sentencing finds that the situation does not warrant a death sentence. So one way or the other, an individual's life is placed in the hand of someone else to determine whether or not he lives or dies. Of course, persons who are retentionists would say, well, that person killed someone. So, how could you be using that argument in his favor and not care about the victim? And we would have gone through it. There are numerous reasons why no one, including no one, should have that right or authority, whether it's supported by legislation or not, to determine who lives or dies. That really should be something left, if you are religious, to God. If you're not, it should be left to biology. Whether someone has the legal right to kill, it's still taking a life that you have not given. And if it turns out that you are wrong, then that is one mistake that you cannot reverse. Many times when women are convicted for murder, one would find that the reasons are usually not gang related. The overwhelming reason would be either because of domestic violence or protecting a member of the family. And I just wanted to give you a little story of one of the very popular cases of why you really have to pause and think about, not that murder is ever justified, but just saving the death penalty is not necessarily the best thing. Her name is Fatima. I cannot pronounce her last name, but it is spelled Haqiqatpajuh. She was executed in 2008, which would have been the same year that St. Kitts had its last execution, for defending her daughter from being raped by her husband. So Fatima was arrested in 2001 following the disappearance of her husband, Mohammed, and discovered his body was later discovered in a river near Tehran. During the trial of her husband's murder, Fatima said she woke up, heard noises from her daughter's room. She ran there and saw her daughter's defenseless and naked body in the hands of her husband. She attacked him. She said, "My child was only 15 and was crushed under his body. I fought with him." And during her trial, she only had one session to defend herself, and she did not have an attorney at law. Of course, when it comes to economics, especially single women, the ability to afford the best counsel may not necessarily be there. Then there are stories about many stories of women killing their partners. As I said, it's huge. Well, I shouldn't say all, but the statistics suggest more often than not that it's some form of abuse or violence, either on themselves or their children. or sometimes they are framed, or sometimes, you know, they live with a particular, in some countries where you can have the death sentence for drugs and stuff, sometimes their husband may be involved. They may not necessarily know, or may not necessarily be in a position to insist that he does not do this, but because you live there, you may become part of the persons arrested, charged, and convicted, and that sort of thing. So there are many stories out there, and there are many stories of women who have been exonerated. This year, on the 10th of October, the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty will be having a webinar in which some of the women who have gone through sentences to death, had it commuted to life, lived a very long life in prison before they were exonerated based on new evidence, or based on counsel coming forward with the type of experience on appeal. And, you know, they would have lost so many years of their lives. Their children would have gone into orphanage or grew up without a mother, because the system is a flawed system. At the end of the day, that's a very real reality. The legal system, as much as we would not want it to be, the legal system is flawed. And so there are many cases where you have innocent people, or persons who may not have or should not have been executed, or persons who should not have been convicted, being convicted, and in some cases executed, because, you know, we're still holding on to that old an eye for an eye, tooth for tooth type of mentality.
Thank you so much, Angelina. You know, the theme chosen for this year, I think, really speaks for itself. As you mentioned, we've seen, perhaps even here and across the region, where whenever women are convicted for murder, it is because of a situation where they were defending a family member or a loved one, their daughter, the children, or some sort of domestic violence that was ongoing for some time. And so the defense that may be used is that they were simply defending themselves. And as you're looking at the death penalty, I wanted to ask, with the crimes that are now being, or that have been committed here in St Kitts and Nevis over the past, let's say, 10 years, one would want to push the argument for there to be the, let me say, not reinstallation, but for us to go back to the death penalty. What is your perspective on that?
There is a, well, I would answer that with two responses. The first is that there have been a number of research done, and those you can find on the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty website, among others, or even if you just put it in, where it has been shown that executing someone does not deter others from committing murder. I was not here in 2008, but the resources that we are given, and based on the research that was done in St Kitts, the crime rate rose in 2009 after Mr. Laplace was executed. In fact, I believe St Kitts crime rate, murder rate in particular, would have gone up for a number of years up until relatively recently. So even in St Kitts, you can see for yourself that execution did not necessarily deter others from committing the heinous act of murder. And there are research, as I said, that have been done to show that it's not a deterrent. So that belief is not supported by statistics. My second response would be that you can't focus on the end and say, well, we should just start hanging people because that's going to solve the crime. You should really start at the cause of why do you have increase in murders? What is the real cause of that? Resources should be spent trying to fix that issue so that no one dies. as opposed to having 2 or 3 individuals die. And until we get there as a society, then, just taking a life is almost like a coward's way out of what is an issue with a broken society, broken homes. So that would be my brief response to that notion.
And based on the statistics, it may suggest that it could be, or may have been a retaliation because of the that death sentence. People responding to it. So while one may think that, well, to stop crime or to stop people from murdering, let us just bring back the death penalty. But that may not necessarily be the case. You perhaps may be, angering the society, and other people would want to perhaps retaliate. Because let's say you may hang somebody, and a family member might come back about 2-3 years later in retaliation, and they might, let me say, try something. And so not necessarily that, having the death penalty is the answer to slowing or curbing the murder rate, as some people may think. But it's a delicate conversation because, as you mentioned before, some would hold the argument that if you kill someone, you should be killed. But at the same time, no one has the right to determine who lives or die.
Yeah. And I mean, I've always maintained, not because a law has been passed saying that the state can carry out execution. Isn't that retaliation, albeit sanctioned by the state? And then when you live in societies that are flawed, and all societies are flawed, that the death sentence is usually preserved, at least in our jurisdiction, for treason as well as murder. You don't want to give a state that has a lot of power over the society, especially when it's a small society. You don't know, let's say, God forbid, you end up having a nefarious head of state, and they decide that they want to charge the opposition with treason, maybe because you were protesting, and the person that used a stone, which I don't condone, that ended up injuring Prime Minister Gonzalez's head. It's not right at all. I definitely don't condone that. But that person, that individual, that lady, and actually I believe it's a female, she can very well be, if found guilty, sentenced to death. Now, I'm not justifying in any way what she did, but some of the reports coming out already suggest that she was an opposition activist and everything else. And then you don't know what kind of motivations, when you see someone not as an individual who did something that was extremely wrong and who should face consequences, but take it to the extent of murder by way of death. You always have to be very careful. There's also a real reality that witnesses lie. There's also a real reality that you have, and we could use St Kitts again because it's always good to bring it home. There was a particular individual of Caucasian descent who was sentenced to death for murdering an individual here, and he spent many, many years in jail in St Kitts. And he kept saying, I had nothing to do with this. If you look into my computer and my IP address and whatever, you would see that at the time the particular crime was committed, I was online doing whatever. Somehow the computer was never found. And years later, it turned out that the computer was in a particular police officer's possession as his own. That individual was released from prison, and he sued the St. Kitts government for malicious prosecution, false imprisonment. I believe it's still going through the motion. And the individual, the police officer that was accused, I would use the word accused, of taking the laptop, He's not being prosecuted. He was allowed to resign, and he's working privately in an institution that the government also has shares in, or at least a say in. And that's in St Kitts. And I'm sure there are many who, based on what I've said, can identify who those individuals are. So you always have to be very, very careful when you allow a state to have so much power, because things can go wrong. I've had, as I would have said last year, I had the opportunity to be part of a legal team in which there were 4 individuals that were on death row. And one of them, after the death penalty project got involved, one of them had to be exonerated because he turned out to be legally a minor, but he would have never had the benefit of a psychological report before. I can also say, having read all 3 psychological reports that were issued before Mr. Laplace was executed, I am very confident that had Mr. Laplace had proper representation, he would be alive today. At least he would not have died by way of hanging, because the conflicts in the psychological reports would be sufficient to show that this person perhaps was operating with diminished capacity at the time, and so he should be given a life sentence or a term sentence, because whether he was right or wrong, whatever beliefs that he had and whatever provocations that he claimed to have had manifested itself in that way. 2 of the 3 psychological reports would have assisted in him having a sentence other than death. But based on the reports that came out, the entire population was very upset, and understandably so, about the manner in which he carried out the crime that he did. And the focus was solely on that. And as a result of that, 3 children were left without any parents at all. So I am always very insistent on, putting faces and stories behind these individuals, because yes, they may be the worst of us, but what is supposed to make us more civil is that we don't believe in barbaric forms of punishment. That's what should differentiate us from those who are not so strong in their ways, and who may have committed the crime or crimes of murder. It does not bring back the victim. People talk about retribution, but it's not going to. You may think that retribution should be an element, but that's really not up to us, because maybe that person, as you said, maybe a second death, maybe because someone believed that their relative was killed, and so they decide they're going to retaliate because they need retribution and kill the other person. It's not going to bring back anyone. It's not going to make you miss that individual anymore. It's not going to fill a hole in your heart or anything of the sort. It is just going to be, as Mahatma Gandhi said, eye for an eye would leave us all blind. So there really isn't in Us Abolitionists book a real human justification for retaining the death penalty.
As we begin to wrap up, Angelina, quickly, if I may ask you, now, abolishing the death penalty, do you think the culture and the mindset of the people would have a positive or negative impact on that?
I think, and this is why we start up with education, I think education has to play a very, very important role, because you're born into a culture and you inherit a particular set of beliefs that the death penalty should be there, whether it's used or not, whether it's effective or not. And so before abolition actually happens, we do believe that we have to inform the members of society And I do think it has to be a conversation that comes not just from the grassroots come up, but also from the top come down. And I do believe, I have sessions with persons, whether it's small college groups or whether it's a bigger forum, when you really inform people of, the real consequences and implications from it. A lot of them, even if they don't convert into being an abolitionist, at least they can pause and say, you know what, I can understand why in this situation or that situation, it is not something I would necessarily support. People also don't understand that it's exceptionally expensive to execute someone lawfully, because you have to give them representation all the way up to the Privy Council and back, as in the state has to pay for that representation if the individual cannot afford it, before you execute that individual. And if that does not happen, the entire process within 5 years, then his sentence or her sentence will still automatically have to be commuted to life, because the Privy Council has already said to keep someone with a death penalty hanging over their head for 5 years is cruel and inhumane treatment. And anyone who's had that experience, their sentence should be converted to either life or a term sentence. So it's also a very expensive process to carry out the death penalty, which you also have to factor in, when that individual could probably be at prison, be reformed, or even, being alive, even if they come out, be able to pay some sort of financial compensation to the victims and that sort of thing. There are different ways that the victims can still get some sort of vindication for the wrong that has happened to their family member, or the family member, of the victim. But but taking the individual's life helps nobody really.
Thank you so much, Angelina. As we begin to wrap up, do you have anything else that you would like to put in at this point?
I just want to give the 10 basic reasons why we believe the death penalty, or 10 reasons to end it. The first being, no state should have the power to take a person's life. 2, it's irrevocable. 3, it is inefficient and does not keep society safe. 4, it is unfair, as it disproportionately discriminates against poor people, women, minority groups, Black people, Not all murder victim families want the death penalty. 6, it creates pain. 7, it's inhumane, cruel, and degrading. 8, it applies overwhelmingly in violation of international standards. 9, it is counterproductive, as it does not reduce murder rates. And 10, it denies any possibility of rehabilitation for criminals. And just to end, we at GCL, we do not forsake that the families of victims are also suffering. We do believe that crimes should be punished, but lives should not be taken. We do not believe that killing in the name of justice amounts to justice.
Thank you so much, Angelina. We are out of time. It's 1:30, and so we're going to wrap up this program. Let me say thank you so much for coming on today to talk about to bring awareness to abolishing the death penalty. As you know, on October 10th, the 19th World Day Against the Death Penalty, with the theme Women and the Death Penalty, an Invisible Reality. Thank you so much, and I hope to have you back as soon to continue this conversation, as there is so much more to talk about.
Thank you for having me. And you keep safe as well as your listening audience.
Thank you so much. Have a good one. This was Voices on WINN FM 98.9, and you were just listening to Angelina Sugu, Bob, an attorney at law, bringing awareness to abolishing the death penalty in the Greater Caribbean. Coming up next, we're going to have Working for You. I've been your host for Voices for today, Devon Cornelius.
WINN is 98.9. 98.9 is WINN FM.